The tray hit the floor before I even saw it coming. Metal clattered against the polished stone tiles of the cafeteria, and my food scattered in every direction, a mess of blue paste and boiled greens sliding across the floor in front of 400 students. For a second, the entire hall went quiet. Then the laughter started. I did not look down at the mess first. I looked up. 5 of them stood in a loose half-circle around me, all wearing the dark green training jackets of the Caldron Cadet Division. Their skin had that dull, armored sheen that Caldron skin always had, thick plates layered over their forearms and shoulders, built for a species that treated physical dominance as a language. The tallest one, a broad-shouldered cadet named Corin Vess, was still smiling, one hand resting lazily against his hip, like he had not just knocked a tray out of my hands in front of the entire student body. "Careful, little one," he said, using the nickname the Caldrons had given every human cadet on this station. "Your kind should watch where you walk." More laughter. Someone near the drink dispenser filmed it on a handheld projector, the little blue light blinking as it recorded. I want to tell you that in that moment I felt angry. I did not. What I felt was something colder, quieter, and far more familiar. It was the same feeling I used to get standing in a combat simulator back on Earth, watching a countdown tick towards 0. It was the feeling of a switch flipping somewhere behind my ribs, a switch I had learned, a long time ago, to keep locked. My name is Ethan Cole. I was 17 years old when I became the first human ever accepted into the Varsan Academy, an interstellar training school built by an alliance of 11 species to prepare young cadets for service in the Joint Defense Fleet. Out of every species enrolled there, humans were considered the weakest. Slow reflexes by galactic standards. No natural armor, no claws, no venom, no enhanced strength. On paper, we were the punching bags of the galaxy, and everyone at that school, students and teachers alike, had made that very clear to me since the day I arrived 3 months earlier. Corin and his 4 friends had made it a habit. It started small, tripping me in the hallway, knocking books out of my hands, whispering insults in a language they thought I could not understand, not realizing the translator chip behind my ear caught every word. It had escalated slowly, the way these things always do, each incident a little bolder than the last, because nothing ever happened to them. No punishment, no consequence, just a human boy picking himself up off the floor while everyone watched and did nothing. Today was different. Today, they had done it in front of the entire cafeteria, in front of cameras, in front of the one person at this school who actually paid attention to me, a young Trellian cadet named Wren who was staring at the scene from 2 tables over with wide, worried eyes. I bent down and started picking up the pieces of my tray. My hands were steady. My breathing was slow and even, the way I had been trained to breathe when everything inside me wanted to do something else entirely. "Nothing to say, little one?" Corin asked, stepping closer, his shadow falling over me. No clever human comeback. I set the tray down on the table beside me. I straightened up. I looked him directly in the eyes, and for the first time since I had arrived at this school, I did not look away first. "No," I said quietly, "not today." Something in my voice must have registered differently than usual, because Corin's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before he laughed it off, glancing at his friends. The other 4 cadets, a wiry one named Dessa, 2 heavy-set brothers everyone called the Marn twins, and a quiet one in the back named Tholik, all chuckled along with him, though I noticed Tholik's laugh was a beat too late, a half-second of hesitation that told me he had noticed something the others had not. "Big words for someone whose species can be knocked over by a strong wind," Corin said, and reached out, grabbing the front of my jacket with one clawed hand, lifting me half an inch off my feet, the way he had done a dozen times before, always to remind me exactly where I stood in the food chain here. I let him. I want to be honest about that part, because it matters. I let him grab me. I let him think, for just one more moment, that nothing had changed. because the moment before someone realizes they have made a mistake is often the most valuable moment you will ever have, and I had learned a long time ago never to waste it. "You know," I said, my voice calm, almost conversational, "back on Earth, we have a saying, never wake a sleeping dog." Corin tilted his head, confused by the phrase, his grip on my jacket loosening just slightly as he processed the translation lag. "What does that mean?" he asked. I looked past him, at the 4 other cadets standing behind him, each one relaxed, confident, utterly certain that nothing in this cafeteria could possibly threaten them. I looked at the shattered tray on the floor, at the blue paste soaking into the tile, at Ren's worried face 2 tables away, and at the small blinking light of the projector still recording everything. "It means," I said, "you should have let the human eat his lunch in peace." The cafeteria was loud with the ordinary noise of 400 students, but for the next 10 seconds, everything around me seemed to slow down and go quiet, the way it always did right before something happened that could not be taken back. Corin's grip tightened again, his patience running out, his hand pulling back to shove me down onto the floor one more time, just like he had done every single week since I arrived at this school. His hand never got there. I moved before I had even finished deciding to move, the years of training taking over the way they were designed to, my body reacting faster than my thoughts could keep up with. My right hand came up and caught his wrist, not with strength, because I had none that could compare to his, but with precision, twisting at an angle his joint was never built to bend in a way that made every plate of armor on his forearm useless. Corin made a sound I had never heard a cauldron make before, somewhere between a growl and a gasp, and dropped to one knee in front of me, his massive frame folding downward like a puppet with its strings cut. The cafeteria went completely silent. And that silence was the last quiet moment before everything changed forever. The silence did not last. It never does. Corin's 4 friends had spent half a second frozen, staring at their leader kneeling on the floor in front of me, before instinct took over and they moved as a group. Cauldrons were pack hunters by nature, something bred into their species over thousands of years of evolution, on a world where survival meant coordinating attacks against creatures far larger than themselves. When one of them fell, the others did not hesitate. They swarmed. I want to explain something before I continue, because it matters for everything that happened next. I did not grow up on a quiet farm somewhere in the countryside, dreaming about space travel and alien worlds the way most human cadets at this academy had. My father served 22 years in the Terran Defense Corps, most of it in close-quarters combat units stationed on colony worlds where diplomacy had already failed and survival depended on something far more immediate than words. My mother was a combat medic who had seen more injuries in a single deployment than most doctors see in a lifetime. I grew up in a household where dinner conversations sometimes included detailed breakdowns of joint locks and pressure points, not because my parents wanted to raise a fighter, but because they wanted to raise a survivor. And on Earth, in the years after first contact, when humanity was still trying to figure out where it stood among a galaxy full of species that did not consider us particularly important, survival skills were not optional. By the time I turned 12, I had already logged more hours in close-quarters combat training than most soldiers complete in their entire first year of service. My father called it insurance. My mother called it common sense. I called it exhausting. Back then, before I understood why it mattered. I understood now. The rules at Varsan Academy were simple, at least on paper. Physical altercations between cadets were against regulations. Serious violations resulted in expulsion. But there was an unwritten rule underneath the written one, a rule every student on this station understood without ever being told directly. Provoked confrontations, ones where a cadet defended themselves against clear and repeated aggression, were rarely punished with the same severity, especially when witnesses and recordings made it obvious who had started things. The instructors here valued strength. They valued cadets who could handle themselves. What they did not tolerate was weakness, and for 3 months, every single person at this school had assumed that word described me perfectly. They were about to learn otherwise. Dessa moved first, coming in low and fast from my left side, her wiry frame built for speed rather than raw power the way the Marn twins were. She reached for my shoulder, claws extended, aiming to spin me around and pin my arm behind my back, a move I recognized instantly because I had drilled the counter to it hundreds of times in training simulators that replicated exactly this kind of pack-based attack. I did not try to overpower her. I never intended to. Overpowering a Caldron cadet with raw strength was not a fight I could ever win, and I had known that from the very first day I set foot on this station. Strength was never going to be my advantage here. Precision was. As her hand closed around my shoulder, I dropped my weight low and pivoted into her, using her own forward momentum against her, redirecting the force of her attack instead of resisting it. Her arm extended past its natural range, and a controlled pressure against the joint sent her stumbling forward, off balance, directly into the path of one of the Marn twins who was closing in from behind me. They collided. It was not a hard hit, not something that should have hurt either of them under normal circumstances, but their combined momentum sent them both crashing into the edge of a nearby table, scattering trays and drink containers across the floor in a loud clatter that seemed to echo through the frozen cafeteria. I did not stop moving. Stopping was the mistake that got people hurt in situations like this. My father used to say, over and over, during every single training session we ever ran together. Momentum was a weapon, and hesitation was the enemy. The second Marn twin, larger and slower than his brother, came at me directly, choosing brute force over technique, exactly the kind of predictable attack pattern I had studied and countered 1,000 times before. He swung a heavy arm toward my head, a strike that would have ended the confrontation instantly if it had connected, given the sheer mass behind a Caldron's upper body strength. It did not connect. I ducked under the swing, closing the distance instead of retreating from it, moving inside the range where his strength advantage mattered least. From close range, a strike that powerful had almost no room to build momentum, and I used the brief opening to drive my palm upward into the soft tissue beneath his jaw, a strike designed not to cause lasting harm, but to disrupt his balance and disorient him just long enough to remove him from the confrontation entirely. He staggered backward, clutching at his face, momentarily stunned, and collided with a support pillar near the center of the cafeteria, hard enough that I heard the dull thud of impact, even over the growing noise of the crowd around us. 3 down, 2 remained. Tholik, the quiet one, the one who had hesitated before laughing at Corin's joke earlier, was the only one of the group who had not moved yet. He stood a few feet away, watching everything unfold with an expression I recognized immediately, because I had worn that same expression myself, more than once, back when I was younger, and still learning that hesitation in a fight was its own kind of decision. He was afraid. I did not have time to think about him for long, because the 5th member of the group, a Caldron named Vesik who I had rarely interacted with directly, chose that exact moment to attack from behind, wrapping a thick arm around my throat in a grip clearly meant to restrain rather than injure, the kind of hold designed to end a fight by simply removing an opponent's ability to breathe. For a moment, panic tried to claw its way up through my chest, the ancient animal part of my brain screaming that I could not breathe, that something was very wrong, that I needed to fight the grip directly with everything I had. I had trained against this exact scenario more times than I could count, and every single time, my instructors had told me the same thing. Do not fight the grip, fight the structure holding it in place. I drove my elbow backward into Vesik's ribs, not with maximum force, but with precise placement, aiming for a cluster of nerve endings that even a heavily armored species like the Caldrons could not fully protect. His grip loosened for just a fraction of a second, and that fraction of a second was all I needed. I dropped my chin, twisted my body, and slipped free of the hold entirely, spinning to face him directly. Vesik, larger than the others and clearly the strongest of the group, recovered quickly and lunged toward me again, determined to finish what he had started. I stepped to the side rather than backward, letting his own forward momentum carry him past me, and used the opening created by his overextension to sweep his legs out from beneath him. He hit the floor hard, the impact loud enough to draw a collective gasp from the crowd of students who had gathered in a wide circle around us, without me even noticing them arrive. 4 down. 1 remained. Tholik still had not moved. I turned to face him, my chest rising and falling steadily, my hands loose at my sides, rather than raised in a fighting stance, because everything about my posture, everything about my expression, was telling him exactly what I wanted him to understand, without a single word being spoken. This does not have to include you. He understood. I watched the tension drain slowly out of his shoulders, watched his clenched fists relax, watched him take a single step backward instead of forward, and in that moment, I felt something I had not expected to feel in the middle of everything that had just happened. Not triumph, not satisfaction, just a quiet, tired relief that at least one of them had chosen not to continue something that never needed to start in the first place. Around me, the cafeteria remained frozen in complete silence, 400 students staring at the scene in front of them, at Corin still kneeling on the floor, at Dessa and one of the Marn twins tangled together beside an overturned table, at the second twin slumped against a pillar, at Vesik flat on his back staring up at the ceiling, and at me, standing in the middle of it all, breathing evenly, having thrown exactly 0 of the first strikes in the entire confrontation. Somewhere near the back of the crowd, I heard the quiet, unmistakable sound of a handheld projector still recording, its little blue light blinking steadily, capturing every single second of what had just happened for the entire station, and eventually, the entire galaxy, to see. I looked down at my ruined lunch tray still lying on the floor where it had started all of this, picked it up, walked to the food dispenser, requested a fresh meal, and sat down at an empty table to eat in silence. Behind me, I could hear the first sounds of instructors rushing into the cafeteria, alerted by students who had already fled to find help, their voices sharp with confusion and disbelief as they took in the scene in front of them. I did not turn around. I finished my lunch. There would be time for everything else soon enough. Later that evening, sitting alone in my quarters, I replayed the entire encounter in my mind, second by second, the way I had been trained to review every engagement, successful or not. My instructors back on Earth always said that understanding exactly what happened during a fight mattered more than simply winning it, because winning without understanding was just luck wearing a disguise, and luck eventually runs out. So let me walk you through it properly, the way I walked through it myself that night, staring at the ceiling of a small dormitory room 3 months into what was supposed to be the most important opportunity of my life. It began with the grip. Corin had grabbed the front of my jacket, lifting me slightly off the ground, exactly the way he had done every single time before, confident in a pattern that had never once failed him. That confidence was the first mistake, though he had no way of knowing it yet. Predictability is a weakness in any confrontation, and Corin had been predictable for 3 straight months. When I caught his wrist and twisted, I was not relying on strength, because I had none that could compare to a Kaldrin's raw physical power. Their species had evolved on a world with heavier gravity than Earth, developing dense muscle structures and reinforced skeletal systems that made them naturally 2 to 3 times stronger than an average human of similar size. Trying to match that strength directly would have been a losing strategy from the very first second. Instead, I relied on something every human learns instinctively long before we ever set foot among the stars, something baked so deeply into our physiology that most of us never even think about it. Human joints, particularly the wrist and elbow, are remarkably efficient levers when force is applied at the correct angle. A Kaldrin's armored plating protected the outer surface of their forearms brilliantly, but it did almost nothing to reinforce the internal structure of the joint itself, because their species had never needed that kind of protection before. On their homeworld, nothing had ever exploited that particular weakness, because nothing on their homeworld fought the way humans did. That was the first lesson my father ever taught me in our garage back on Earth, standing across from me on cold concrete floors while my mother watched from the doorway with her arms crossed, silently timing every single drill with an old stopwatch she had carried through 3 different deployments. He used to say that every creature in the universe has weaknesses, and the ones who survive are not always the strongest ones, but the ones who study the weaknesses of everything around them, including their own. When Dessa attacked from my left side, moving low and fast, she was relying on speed rather than raw strength, which made her genuinely dangerous in a way the others were not. If she had managed to get behind me and lock my arm the way she intended, I would have been in serious trouble, because from that position, her natural strength advantage would have mattered far more than my precision could compensate for. But speed-based attacks share a common vulnerability that strength-based attacks do not. They rely entirely on forward momentum, and forward momentum, once committed, is extremely difficult to redirect mid-motion. My father used to call this the freight train principle. A freight train moving at full speed is incredibly powerful in a straight line, but almost helpless the moment you shift the tracks beneath it. I shifted the tracks. By dropping my weight and pivoting into her attack rather than away from it, I used her own forward momentum to carry her past me entirely, sending her directly into the path of the nearest Marn twin. This is a fundamental principle of close-quarters combat that many species, including Caldrons, tend to underestimate, because most species that rely heavily on physical strength develop combat instincts built around meeting force with greater force. Humans, historically speaking, have almost never had the luxury of assuming we were the strongest creature in any given confrontation, whether facing larger predators during our earliest history or facing each other in countless conflicts throughout our long and complicated past. We learned, over tens of thousands of years, to fight smart because we often could not afford to fight strong. The collision between Dessa and the first Marn twin was not something I orchestrated with precision timing. It was simply the natural consequence of redirected momentum meeting an obstacle that happened to be standing exactly where physics dictated it would land. I did not need it to be perfect. I only needed it to remove 2 threats from the confrontation simultaneously, buying myself the time and space to address the remaining 3. The second Marn twins' attack was the most straightforward of the entire encounter, and honestly, the easiest to counter, because he relied entirely on raw power delivered through a single predictable strike. Larger, slower opponents who depend primarily on strength often telegraph their attacks well before they land, because generating that much force requires a wind-up, a visible shift in weight and posture that gives an observant opponent valuable time to react. I had trained against exactly this kind of attack more times than I could count, sparring against instructors wearing weighted suits designed to simulate the mass and power of larger alien species, drilling the same footwork and timing over and over until it became something my body understood without needing conscious thought to execute. Closing the distance rather than retreating from it felt counterintuitive to almost everyone the first time they tried it, because every instinct screams at you to create space between yourself and a larger, stronger opponent. But space is exactly what a strength-based attacker needs to generate maximum force. Remove the space, and you remove much of the power behind the strike. The palm strike beneath his jaw was not designed to cause serious harm. It was designed to disrupt his inner ear balance and momentarily disorient him, a technique that works remarkably well on nearly any bipedal species with a centralized nervous system, regardless of their physical strength or natural armor. Strength cannot protect you from a strike that disrupts your ability to remain standing. Vesek's attempt to restrain me from behind was, in some ways, the most dangerous moment of the entire encounter, because unlike the others, he was not trying to strike me, he was trying to control me, to end the confrontation quickly and decisively by simply removing my ability to breathe and struggle effectively. This is a technique that works exceptionally well against most opponents, human or otherwise, because the panic response triggered by restricted airflow is almost universal among oxygen-breathing species, and panic makes people fight the wrong thing. Every combat instructor I ever trained under drilled the same principle into me relentlessly. When someone restrains you, Your first instinct will always be to fight the grip directly, to claw at the arm around your throat, to try to physically pry it away through sheer force. This almost never works against an opponent who is significantly stronger than you, and Vesic was considerably stronger than me. What does work, far more often than people expect, is attacking the structure that allows the grip to exist in the first place. A chokehold requires stability. It requires the person applying it to maintain their own balance and positioning while simultaneously controlling yours. Disrupt that stability, and the grip becomes far easier to escape, regardless of how much raw strength stands behind it. The elbow strike to his ribs was aimed at a specific cluster of nerve endings that even heavily armored species struggle to fully protect, simply because the human elbow is uniquely suited to delivering concentrated, focused force through very small surface areas. It is one of the hardest and most durable points on the entire human body, something most species outside our solar system had never fully appreciated until recently, because most species did not evolve the way we did, walking upright, hands and arms free to develop specialized functions beyond simple locomotion. The moment his grip loosened, everything else followed naturally from years of repetition, dropping my chin to protect my throat, twisting my body to slip free of the remaining pressure, spinning to face him directly rather than allowing him to re-establish control from behind. None of it was improvised in the true sense of the word. It only looked improvised, because it happened quickly and instinctively, the way a well-trained response always does when executed under pressure. Sweeping his legs out from beneath him after he lunged forward again was simply a matter of using his own momentum against him one final time, the same principle that had worked against Dessa minutes earlier, applied to a much larger and stronger opponent who had made the same fundamental mistake of committing fully to a single, direct attack. And then there was Tholik. I think about that moment more than any other part of the entire encounter, more than the strikes, more than the counters, more than the sweeps and pivots, and precisely calculated pressure points. I think about the moment I turned to face him, hands loose at my sides, and watched him choose, on his own, without any further need for force or persuasion, to step backward instead of forward. That moment mattered because it proved something my father had told me years earlier, something I had never fully believed until I stood in that cafeteria and watched it happen with my own eyes. He told me that most conflicts, even violent ones, are not actually about strength or skill in the end. They are about choice. Every single person involved in a confrontation, no matter how it begins, eventually reaches a point where they choose whether to continue or to stop, and the people who understand that choice, who recognize it clearly, and offer it honestly to everyone around them, are the ones who end conflicts the fastest and with the least amount of harm to everyone involved. I never wanted to fight 5 cadets in the middle of a crowded cafeteria. I never wanted any of what happened that day to happen at all. But I had also spent 3 months absorbing quiet humiliation after quiet humiliation, watching every appeal to a teacher or supervisor go nowhere, watching the unwritten rules of this school protect the strong at the expense of anyone perceived as weak, and somewhere along the way I had made a decision of my own, long before that tray ever hit the floor. I decided that the next time it happened, it would be the last time it happened. 10 seconds. That is how long the entire confrontation lasted, according to the recording that had already begun circulating through the station's private networks before I had even finished my second lunch that day. 10 seconds. From the moment Corin's grip tightened on my jacket to the moment Tholik took his single step backward, 5 cadets, 5 decisive moments, 5 choices that would ripple outward through the rest of my time at this academy in ways I could not yet fully understand. I turned off the lights in my dormitory room that night, lying awake far longer than I should have, staring at the dim glow of the station's artificial night cycle through my window, and I wondered, quietly, what tomorrow was going to look like. I did not have to wonder for very long. By the time morning arrived, the entire station already knew what had happened. I discovered this the moment I stepped out of my dormitory and into the main corridor, where the usual quiet murmur of students heading to their first class had been replaced by something else entirely. Conversations stopped as I passed. Heads turned. A group of younger cadets from a species I did not recognize pressed themselves against the wall to give me extra space, whispering to each other in a language my translator chip only partially understood, though I caught enough to recognize the word for human, repeated several times in tones that sounded far less dismissive than they had 3 months earlier. Ren caught up with me near the transit lift, her expression somewhere between concern and barely contained curiosity. "You are the only thing anyone is talking about," she said, falling into step beside me. "Do you know that already went to the medical wing?" All 5 of them? I had not known the exact details yet, only that instructors had arrived quickly enough to see the aftermath and immediately ordered medical evaluations for everyone involved, myself included, though my evaluation had taken considerably less time than the others. "Are they seriously hurt?" I asked, and I meant the question honestly, because despite everything, causing lasting harm to anyone had never been my intention. Ren shook her head slowly. Bruised. A dislocated wrist. Some swelling. Nothing permanent, from what I heard, though I also heard the medical staff seemed genuinely surprised by that. They kept saying the injuries did not match what they expected from a confrontation involving a human. That surprised reaction, as it turned out, was only the beginning. I was summoned to the administrative wing before my first class even started, escorted by a staff member who said almost nothing during the walk, glancing at me periodically with an expression I could not quite read. We arrived at a small conference room where 3 people were already waiting. Instructor Halvek, the Academy's senior combat education supervisor, a broad-shouldered Grathari with pale gray skin and calm, measuring eyes. Administrator Corvin Aldis, the human liaison officer assigned to Varson Academy, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a datapad already open in front of him. And a third figure I did not recognize immediately, seated slightly apart from the other 2, watching me with quiet, careful attention. "Cadet Cole," Administrator Aldis said, gesturing toward an empty seat across from them. "Please, sit." I sat. "I imagine you know why you are here," Instructor Halvek said, his translated voice carrying a low, resonant quality that made every word sound deliberate. "I assume it involves yesterday's incident in the cafeteria," I said. "It does," Halvek confirmed. "We have reviewed 3 separate recordings of the confrontation, along with witness statements from over a dozen students who were present. I want to be direct with you, Cadet Cole. This academy takes physical altercations between students extremely seriously." My stomach tightened slightly, despite everything I had told myself the night before about the unwritten rules protecting cadets who defended themselves against clear aggression. "However," Halvek continued, "the recordings are equally clear about who initiated the confrontation, and about the fact that you did not throw a single strike until physical contact had already been made against you, repeatedly, over an extended period of time, according to statements from multiple witnesses describing a pattern of behavior stretching back several months." Administrator Aldis leaned forward slightly. "Why didn't you report any of this sooner, Ethan? There are procedures in place for exactly this kind of situation." I thought carefully about how to answer that question, because the honest answer was complicated and I did not want it to sound like an excuse. "I reported the first incident 3 months ago," I said. "Nothing happened. I was told it was likely a misunderstanding, a difference in cultural expectations around physical contact between students from different species. After that, I stopped reporting it, because I did not believe it would change anything. I mean it." The room fell silent for a moment. Administrator Aldis exchanged a brief glance with Instructor Halvek, something passing between them that I could not fully interpret. "That is a fair criticism of our systems," Halvek said finally, his tone carrying something that almost sounded like genuine discomfort, "one we intend to address." The third figure in the room finally spoke, her voice quieter than the others, but carrying a weight that immediately drew my attention. "Cadet Cole, my name is Fleet Commander Ilyara Thess. I oversee strategic assessment for the Joint Defense Coalition. I did not come here today to discuss disciplinary matters. Those have already been resolved, and you will not be facing any consequences for your actions yesterday. I felt some of the tension leave my shoulders, though her next words brought an entirely different kind of tension in its place. I came here because I have watched that recording 11 times since this morning, she continued, and I have questions that have nothing to do with school policy. She activated a small projector on the table between us, and the recording from the cafeteria appeared in the air above it, paused on the exact moment my hand had closed around Corin's wrist. Your species has been part of the coalition for less than a decade, Commander Thess said. Our strategic assessments of humanity, frankly, have not placed a great deal of confidence in your species' combat capabilities compared to more physically dominant coalition members. Lower average strength, slower reflexes by several key metrics, no natural weapons or armor. On paper, human cadets are consistently ranked among the least combat-capable individuals in this academy. I'm aware of that assessment, I said carefully. Then explain this to me, she said, gesturing toward the frozen image above the table. Explain how a cadet who ranks in the bottom third of this academy's physical strength metrics disabled 5 cadets from a species specifically bred for pack-based physical combat in under 10 seconds without sustaining a single injury himself. I hesitated, unsure exactly how much to say, unsure whether this conversation was truly as informal as she claimed it to be. It wasn't strength, I said eventually. It was never going to be strength. I knew that going in, because I've known it my whole life. Humans figured out a long time ago that we usually weren't the strongest thing in any given room, whether that room was full of other humans or something else entirely. So we learned to fight differently. We study weaknesses. We study angles and leverage and timing. We train not to overpower an opponent, but to make their strength irrelevant. Commander Thess studied me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. How long have you personally trained in these techniques? She asked. Since I was 6 years old, I said. My father served over 2 decades in close-quarters combat units. My mother was a combat medic. Neither of them ever expected me to become a soldier, but they both believed, very strongly, that every human child should understand how to protect themselves, because our history taught us that the universe does not automatically extend safety to anyone, human or otherwise, simply because they exist within it. Instructor Halvek leaned back in his seat slowly. Is this training common among human cadets applying to this academy? More common than you might expect, I said honestly. Not universal, but humanity spent most of its history without the kind of advanced technology or natural physical advantages that many coalition species take for granted. We learned early, and painfully, that raw strength was rarely something we could rely on. So instead, we built an entire culture around efficiency, technique, and understanding exactly how a body, any body, human or otherwise, could be made to fail under the right kind of precise pressure. Commander Thess exchanged a long look with Administrator Aldous, one that carried an unmistakable weight, though I could not fully interpret what it meant. I want to be transparent with you, Cadet Cole, she said finally. This recording did not stay contained to this station. It has already reached several coalition military networks, and I suspect, within the next few days, it will reach considerably more than that. Humanity has spent 10 years being quietly underestimated by nearly every species in this coalition, myself included, until this morning. I never wanted this to become something bigger than it was, I said. I just wanted to eat my lunch in peace. For the first time since the meeting began, something that almost resembled a smile crossed Commander Thess's face. I believe you, she said, but I don't think that choice is entirely yours to make anymore. I left that meeting with more questions than answers, walking back through corridors that felt different than they had just 24 hours earlier, aware of eyes following me in ways they never had before, aware that something fundamental had shifted, not just for me personally, but for how an entire academy, and possibly an entire coalition, understood the species I represented. 3 days later, Tholik approached me alone in the training hall, hesitant, his usual confident posture replaced by something quieter, more uncertain. "I wanted to say something," he said, his translated voice careful, measured. "I did not attack you. I want you to know that was a choice, not fear." "I know," I said. "I saw it happen. I appreciated it." He studied me for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes. "The others are still recovering. Physically, they will be fine within another week. I am not certain the same can be said for how they see themselves now, or how the rest of this academy sees them." "That was never something I wanted," I said honestly. "I know," Tholik replied. "That is precisely why I am speaking to you now, instead of avoiding you the way the others have chosen to." He left without saying anything further, and I stood alone in the training hall for a long time afterward, thinking about choices, about consequences that ripple outward in directions no one fully intends or controls, and about a quiet, uncomfortable truth I was only beginning to understand. The fight in that cafeteria had lasted 10 seconds. Everything that followed was going to last considerably longer. 2 weeks after the incident, I stood in the same cafeteria where it had all happened, holding a fresh tray of food, scanning the room out of habit more than genuine concern. The atmosphere had changed in ways I was still adjusting to. Where students had once watched me with quiet dismissal or outright mockery, they now watched with something closer to careful curiosity, occasionally even respect, though respect earned through force rather than friendship always carries a strange, uncomfortable weight to it. Corin approached me during that lunch period, and I noticed immediately how different he looked without his usual entourage trailing behind him. His wrist had healed completely, though he still moved it with a slight, deliberate caution that told me the memory of the injury lingered longer than the physical damage itself. "May I sit?" he asked, his voice carrying none of the arrogance I remembered from 3 months of daily encounters. I gestured to the empty seat across from me, saying nothing, curious where this was going. He sat in silence for a long moment, staring down at his own tray without eating, before finally speaking again. "I have spent 2 weeks trying to understand what happened that day. Not the mechanics of it. I have watched the recording enough times to understand the mechanics perfectly well. I mean the reasons behind it. Why you never reported us properly before that day. Why you chose to end it the way you did, rather than simply avoiding the confrontation entirely by walking away. Would walking away have actually worked?" I asked honestly. Based on 3 months of history, I don't think it would have. You would have found another day, another lunch, another opportunity. I decided it was better to end it clearly and decisively, once, than to let it continue indefinitely. Corin absorbed that answer slowly, his expression unreadable in a way that reminded me, uncomfortably, of how little I actually understood about Caldron emotional expression, despite 3 months of daily interaction. "On my homeworld," he said eventually, "strength determines standing within any group. It has always been this way, for longer than recorded history. When I arrived here and saw human cadets, physically weaker by every metric we measure strength with, I assumed, the way most Caldrons assume, that this weakness reflected something deeper about your species. A lesser standing, something to be tested, and when found lacking, dismissed." "And now?" I asked. "Now I understand that strength and standing are not the same thing everywhere in this galaxy," he said. "Your species measures something different, something I do not yet fully understand, but something I no longer feel comfortable dismissing." It was, I realized, the closest thing to an apology I was likely to receive from him, delivered in the careful, indirect language of someone still working through exactly how much of his worldview needed to change, and how quickly. "I'm not looking for an enemy," I told him honestly. "I never was. I just wanted to be left alone to finish an education, the same as everyone else in this room." "I understand that now," he said. "I am not certain the rest of the coalition understands it quite so clearly yet." He was right about that, more right than either of us fully realized in that moment. Over the following weeks, the recording from the cafeteria continued spreading through coalition networks, reaching not just other academies and training stations, but eventually reaching military strategic assessment boards across multiple member species. I learned later, through conversations with Administrator Aldous, that several coalition governments had quietly requested updated intelligence briefings on human combat capabilities, briefings that had remained largely unchanged since humanity's initial admission into the coalition nearly a decade earlier. The old briefings had described humans as physically unremarkable, technologically capable, but militarily unimpressive compared to species with natural advantages in strength, speed, or specialized biological weapons. 10 seconds of cafeteria footage had apparently been enough to convince several coalition strategists that those assessments deserved serious reconsideration. I found this both gratifying and deeply uncomfortable in equal measure, because it had never been my intention to become a symbol for anything larger than myself. I had wanted, simply and honestly, to eat my lunch without being humiliated in front of my classmates. Everything that followed felt like it belonged to a much larger story that I had never asked to be part of, but somehow found myself standing directly at the center of anyway. Commander Thess requested one final meeting with me before the academic term ended, this time in a smaller, more private office rather than the formal conference room where our first conversation had taken place. "I wanted to update you on something," she said, gesturing for me to sit. "The Coalition Strategic Assessment Board has formally revised its evaluation of human combat capabilities, effective as of this week." "What does that mean, practically speaking?" I asked. "It means several things," she said. "It means human cadets will likely see increased interest from combat-oriented academy tracks across the coalition. It means military strategists across multiple member species are going to spend considerable time and resources studying human close-quarters combat traditions far more seriously than they have in the past. And it means you, specifically, are going to continue being a point of significant interest for people well beyond this academy, whether that is something you wanted or not." "I never asked for any of this," I said quietly. "I know," she replied, her tone softening slightly. "For what it's worth, I don't think that changes anything about how this unfolds from here. Sometimes the things we never asked for end up mattering the most, precisely because we never went looking for them in the first place." I thought about that conversation for a long time afterward, walking back through the same corridors I had walked through on my very first day at this academy, 3 months earlier, when everything about this place had felt overwhelming and unfamiliar, when every other student had looked at me and seen only a fragile, unremarkable human, unlikely to last a full academic term among species so clearly, physically superior in every measurable way. They no longer looked at me that way. I was not entirely certain how I felt about that change, because it had never been my goal to prove anything to anyone. I had only ever wanted to be treated fairly, to be given the same basic respect every other cadet at this academy received without question or hesitation. But I had learned something important during those 3 months, something I carried with me long after that particular academic term ended and new challenges took its place. Respect, real respect, the kind that actually changes how people treat each other going forward, is rarely given freely to anyone, human or otherwise. It has to be earned, sometimes through patience, sometimes through quiet persistence, and sometimes, when every other option has been exhausted, through a clear and undeniable demonstration of exactly what happens when patience finally runs out. I never wanted to become known as the human cadet who ended a fight in 10 seconds. I wanted to be known simply as a good cadet, a capable engineer, a reliable teammate, all the things I had originally come to this academy hoping to become. But I understood, standing in that corridor with new eyes watching me from every direction, that sometimes you do not get to choose the story other people decide to tell about you. What you get to choose, instead, is how you carry that story forward. Ren caught up with me near the transit lift that evening, falling into step beside me the way she often did, her expression carrying a familiar mixture of curiosity and quiet amusement. "You know," she said, "you are going to be studied in combat theory courses for years after we graduate. Some cadet somewhere is going to sit through an entire lecture just about you." "That sounds exhausting," I said honestly. Probably, she agreed, laughing softly. For what it's worth, I always believed you deserved better than what those 5 put you through. I just never expected the answer to be quite so complete. I smiled slightly, thinking back to that quiet moment in the cafeteria, the tray hitting the floor, the laughter, the switch flipping somewhere behind my ribs after months of holding it steady and controlled. Neither did I admitted. I just wanted my lunch. We walked the rest of the way to the transit lift in comfortable silence, and for the first time since arriving at Varson Academy, I felt something I had not expected to feel this early into my time among the stars. I felt, for the very first time since leaving Earth, like I finally belonged exactly where I stood. The galaxy was going to have to get used to that idea. One cafeteria, one academy, one quiet demonstration at a time. And somewhere, far beyond this station, on 100 different worlds across the coalition, military strategists were already rewriting everything they thought they understood about a species they had spent 10 years quietly underestimating. They were only just beginning to understand what humanity had known about itself all along. We were never as fragile as we looked.